The Christian group was dancing down the road, praising their nailed god. But when the priest saw the gold mask covering Morgan's face and the triple antlers and wide-winged dragon of her brooches, he ranted at her as a creature of the devil. The priest must have thought that such a disfigured, hobbling woman would prove an easy prey to his taunting. But an errant preacher accompanied by his wife and holy whores was no match for Igraine's daughter, Merlin's ward, and Arthur's sister. Morgan gave the fellow a single thump on the ear with her heavy staff, a blow that knocked him sideways into a ditch thick with nettles, and then she walked on with scarce a backward glance. The priest's women shrieked and parted. Some prayed and others spat curses, but Nimue glided through their malevolence like a spirit. I carried no weapons, unless a staff and a knife count as a warrior's accoutrement. I'd wanted to carry both a sword and a spear to look like a grown man, but Howl had scoffed that a man was not made by wanting, but by doing. For my protection, he gave me a bronze torque that displayed Merlin's horned god at its finials. No one, he said, would dare challenge Merlin. Yet even so, without a man's weapons, I felt useless. Why, I asked Nimue, was I there?
"Because you're my oath friend, little one," Nimue said.
I was already taller than she, but she used the term affectionately.
"And because you and I are chosen of Bel, and if he chooses us, then we must choose each other."
Then why are the two of us going to Gleevham? I wanted to know.
"Because Merlin wants us there, of course."
"Will he be there?" I asked eagerly. Merlin had been away so very long, and without him Innis Widrum was like a sky without its sun.
"No,"
she said calmly, though how she knew Merlin's desire in this matter I did not know, for Merlin was still far away, and the summons for the High Council had been issued long after his departure. "And what will we do when we reach Gleevham?"
"We'll know when we get there,"
she said mysteriously, and would explain no more. Gleevham, once I had grown accustomed to the overpowering stench of night soil, was marvellously strange. Other than some of the villas that had become farmsteads on Merlin's estates, this was my first time in a proper Roman place, and I gawked at the sights like a newborn chick. The streets were paved with fitted stones, and though they had canted in the long years since the Romans' departure, King Tudric's men had done their best to repair the damage by pulling up the weeds and sweeping away the soil, so that the city's 9 streets looked like stony watercourses in the dry season. It was hard to walk on them, and it made Nimue and me laugh to see horses trying to negotiate the treacherous stones. The buildings were as weird as the streets. We made our halls and houses out of wood, thatch, clay cob and wattle, but these Roman buildings were all joined together and made of stone and strange, narrow bricks, though over the years some of them had collapsed to leave ragged gaps in the long rows of low houses that were curiously roofed with baked clay tiles. The walled city guarded a crossing of the 7, and stood between 2 kingdoms, and near to a third, and so it was a famous trading centre. Potters worked in the houses, goldsmiths stooped over their tables, and calves bellowed in a slaughter-yard behind the marketplace that was crowded with country folk selling butter, nuts, leather, smoked fish, honey, dyed cloth, and newly sheared wool. Best of all, at least to my dazzled eyes, were King Tudric's soldiers. They were Romans, Nimue told me, or at least they were Britons taught the Roman ways, and all kept their beards clipped short, and were dressed alike in sturdy leather shoes and woolen hose beneath short leather skirts. The senior soldiers had bronze plates sewn onto their skirts, and when they walked, the armour plates would clank together like cowbells. Each man had a breastplate polished bright, a long russet cloak, and a leather helmet that was sewn at the crown into a ridge. Some of the helmets were plumed with dyed feathers. The soldiers carried short, broad-bladed swords, long spears with polished staffs, and oblong shields of wood and leather that carried Tudric's bull symbol. The shields were all the same size, the spears all of a length, and the soldiers all marched in step. An extraordinary sight that made me laugh at first, though later I became used to it. At the centre of the town, where the 4 streets from the 4 gates met in a wide open square, there stood a vast and wondrous building. Even Nimue gaped at it, for surely no one living could make such a thing. So high, so white, and so sharply cornered. Pillars held the roof high, and all along the triangular space between the roof's peak and the pillars' tops were fantastic pictures carved in white stone that showed marvellous men trampling enemies beneath their horses' hooves. The stone men carried sheaves of stone spears and wore stone helmets with soaring stone crests. Some of the pictures had dropped away or had split in the frosts, yet were still a miracle to me, though Nimue, after staring at them, spat to ward off the evil. "Don't you like it?" I asked her resentfully.
"The Romans tried to be gods," she said, "which is why the gods humbled them. The council should not meet here."
Yet Gleevum was where the High Council was summoned, and Nimue could not change it. Here, encompassed by Roman ramparts of earth and wood, the fate of Uther's kingdom was to be decided. The High King had already arrived by the time we reached the town. He was lodging in another high building that faced the pillared hall across the square. He showed neither surprise nor displeasure that Nimue had come, perhaps because he thought she was merely a part of Morgan's retinue, and he gave us all a single room in the back of the house where the kitchen smoked and the slaves squabbled. The High King's soldiers looked drab beside Tudric's shining men. Our soldiers wore their hair long and their beards wild. They had patched and frayed cloaks of different colours and carried long, heavy swords, rough, shafted spears, and round shields, on which Uther's dragon symbol looked crude beside Tudric's carefully painted bulls. For the first 2 days there were celebrations. Champions of the 2 kingdoms fought mock fights outside the walls, though when Owain, Uther's champion, went into the arena, King Tudric was forced to pit 2 of his best men against him. Dumnonia's famous hero was reputed to be invincible, and he looked it as he stood with the summer sun glinting off his long sword. He was a huge man, with tattooed arms, a matted bare chest, and a bristling beard decorated with warrior rings forged from the weapons of defeated enemies. His fight against Tudric's 2 champions was supposed to be a mock battle, but the mockery was hard to see as the 2 heroes of Gwent took their turns to attack him. The 3 men fought as though they were filled with hate, and exchanged sword blows that must have rung north into distant Powys, and after a few minutes their sweat was mixed with blood. Their blunt swords' edges were dented, and all 3 men were limping. But Owain was still getting the best of the bout. Despite his size, he was fast with a sword, and his blows carried crushing weight. The crowd, which had gathered from all the country thereabouts, and was thus drawn from both Uther's and Tudric's kingdoms, was shouting like wild beasts to urge their men on to massacre, and Tudric, seeing the passion, threw down his staff to end the fight. "We are friends, remember?" he told the 3 men, and Uther, seated 1 step higher than Tudric, as befitted the High King, nodded agreement. Uther looked gross and ill. His body was swollen with fluid, his face was yellowing and slack, his breathing laboured. He had been carried to the fighting field in a litter, and was swathed on his throne in a heavy cloak that hid his jewelled belt and bright torque. King Tudric dressed as a Roman. Indeed, his grandfather had been a real Roman, which must have explained his foreign-sounding name. The king wore his hair clipped very short, with no beard, and was swathed in a white toga folded intricately at one shoulder. He was tall, thin, and graceful in his movements, and though he was still a young man, the sad, wise look of his face made him seem much older. His queen, Enid, wore her hair in a weird, plaited spiral that was piled so precariously on top of her skull that she was forced to move with the angular awkwardness of a newborn colt. Her face was caked with a white paste that fixed her with a vacant expression of perplexed boredom. Her son, Murig, the Edling of Gwent, was a fidgety child of 10, who sat at his mother's feet and was struck by his father every time he picked his nose. After the fighting, the harpists and bards had their contest. Sinir, the bard of Gwent, sang the great tale of Uther's victory over the Saxons at Caer Idern. Later I realized that Tudric must have ordered it as a tribute to the High King, and certainly the performance pleased Uther, who smiled as the verses rolled by, and nodded whenever a particular warrior was praised. Sinir claimed the victory in a ringing voice, and when he came to the lines which told how Owain had slaughtered Saxons by the 1,000, he turned towards the tired, battered fighter, and one of Tudric's champions, who only an hour before had been trying to beat the big man down, stood and raised Owain's sword arm. The crowd roared. Then they laughed as Sinir adopted a woman's voice to describe the Saxons pleading for mercy. He began to run about the field in little panicked steps, crouching as though hiding, and the crowd loved it. I loved it too, for you could almost see the hated Saxons cowering in terror, and smell the stench of their death blood, and hear the wings of the ravens coming to gorge on their flesh. And then Sinir straightened to his full height, and let his cloak drop away, so that his blue-painted body was naked, and he sang the tribute song of the gods, who had watched their champion, High King Uther of Dumnonia, the Pendragon of Britain, beat down the kings and chiefs and champions of the foe. Then, naked still, the bard prostrated himself before Uther's throne. Uther fumbled beneath his shaggy cloak to find a torque of yellow gold that he tossed towards Sinir. His throw was feeble, and the torque fell on the edge of the wooden dais where the two kings sat. Nimue blanched at the bad omen, but Tudric calmly picked up the torque and carried it to the white-haired bard, whom the king raised up with his own hands. After the bards had sung, and just as the sun was setting behind the low dark rill of western hills that marked the edge of the Silurian lands, a procession of girls brought flowers for the queens. But there was only one queen on the dais, Enid. For a few seconds the girls carrying the heaps of flowers meant for Uther's lady did not know what to do, but Uther stirred himself and pointed at Morgan, who had her own bench beside the dais, so the girls swerved aside and heaped the irises, meadowsweet, and bee-orchids before her.
"She looks like a dumpling,"
Nimue hissed in my ear.
"Garlanded with parsley."
On the night before the High Council, there was a Christian service in the big hall of the great building in the town's centre. Tudric was an enthusiastic Christian, and his followers thronged the hall that was lit by flaming torches set into iron beckets on the walls. It had rained that evening, and the crowded hall stank of sweat, damp wool, and wood smoke. The women stood on the left side of the hall, and the men on the right, though Nimue calmly ignored the arrangement and climbed onto a pedestal that stood behind the dark crowd of cloaked, bare-headed men. There were other such pedestals, most crowned with statues, but our plinth was empty and provided ample space for the two of us to sit and stare at the Christian rites, though at first I was more astonished by the hall's vast interior that was higher, wider, and longer than any feasting hall I had ever seen,